Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we navigate the evolving landscape of environmental, social, and governance, ESG. Join me, Amanda Shea, and Erika Schiller as we explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership.
Hello, and welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Erika Schiller, and today we have Peter Zaman joining us. Peter is a partner at HFW, and he joined us for a podcast that was released in March of this year, talking about COP28 and the progress or lack thereof of Article 6 agreements between the countries. And we touched a little bit about CORSIA, so we're going to jump into that as well today. We also have Anna Stablum joining us. Anna is a director of business development based in Singapore. Peter and Anna are both joining us on their holidays and travels in Europe, so we really appreciate you both joining us today. And Peter, I'm going to kick us off kind of picking up where we left off in March, where we talked about how CORSIA, which is a compliance program for all the international airlines to reduce their carbon emissions, either with biofuels like sustainable aviation fuel or buying carbon offsets. And the CORSIA program tied itself to Article 6. And you kind of hinted at Article 6 from the Paris Agreement is separate from, CORSIA. And CORSIA was trying to use Article 6 to reduce the double claiming so that countries had to use a corresponding adjustment. So, it's pretty complex subject. You've released a few papers, which we will link in the show notes after this, so people can really dig into the details. But I'd love for you to help us understand how is this conversion, from the voluntary carbon programs going into a compliance CORSIA mechanism tied to the Paris Agreement Article 6 corresponding adjustments, and then a totally separate body, CORSIA, and the ICAO organization, which is this international airline organization. How are all those pieces fitting together? And if they're not fitting together, how's the organization dealing with the complexity of this program?
Well, first of all, Erika, thank you for having me back on ESG Decoded. Look, I think you're right to say that this is a technical topic, so I'm going to try and do my best to keep it simple as much as I can. Let me start by dealing with the point that you just mentioned, which is the fact that ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Authority, is the international treaty for airlines. And it's mostly, if you think about it, airline safety treaty. It's very separate from the Paris Agreement, which is an umbrella arrangement that sits under the broader framework of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Two different, international legal treaties. Now, a lot of the countries who are signatories to the Paris Agreement are also signatories to ICAO for very different reasons, right? ICAO is about being able to operate in the international airspace, and every country wants their national airline to be able to do that. So they sign up to a bunch of rules associated with how airlines should, safely and freely travel between one country to another. It's about maintaining insurance, it's about maintaining operational standards, all of that kind of stuff. Paris Agreement, as you will probably know, is very much focused on a country's contribution towards an overall Paris Agreement obligation or target to try and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to a ideally 1.5 degree target, but officially a 2 degree target under the Paris Agreement. And then the question is, how do countries do that? And one of the ways in which countries do that is by every country producing a nationally determined contribution, which is their share of what they're willing to do in the overall idea of meeting a 2 degree or 1.5 degree net zero target. There isn't a bit that says one country has to do X percent, another country has to do Y percent under the Paris Agreement. There's a general understanding that developed countries have to take the lead to try and achieve the net zero obligations faster, and other countries should increase their ambition over time. But eventually they too should also aim for a net zero outcome. the timing of when those two groups of countries developed and developing, if you will, have to meet their overall obligation varies. So if you take the EU as an example, the EU has set themselves a 2050 net zero target. China has set a net zero CO2 emissions target of 2060. So China's basically saying, well, EU, you're a developing country, you take the lead, you do it by 2050, I'll do it by 2060. Now, airline emissions for domestic airline emissions are very much part of a country's overall GHG emissions. So if I'm the United States and I have a flight that takes off in New York and lands in San Francisco, then that's my domestic aviation emissions. That's not my international aviation emissions. But a flight taking off from New York and going from New York to London or New York to Singapore is international aviation emissions. So domestic aviation emissions are very much part of the United States nationally determined contribution in the example that I just gave you. But if you had similar domestic flights, taking the UK as an example, flying between London and Manchester, that would be a domestic aviation emission. But a flight leaving London going to Switzerland would be an international flight. So you've got to recognize that one of the things that ICAO is dealing with is the emissions that are not being dealt with by the country NDC. In other words, international aviation emissions. And what ICAO has committed to is a reduction of international aviation emissions by maintaining the status quo of aviation emissions at 2019 baseline levels set under the CORSIA scheme. And the CORSIA scheme is the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. And it's broken into different phases. We had a pilot phase, which is not every country has to participate, but if you want to do it, you can. We're in what's called phase 1 now, which runs between 2024 and 2026. And again, this is a voluntary phase. Not every international country or airline is participating in it. There's about 126 countries who've signed up to the first phase. And then the mandatory phase, CORSIA, which is where all countries, all airlines have to participate, that starts in 2027 and runs until 2035. And in the context of international aviation emissions, what the 2019 baseline says is that to the extent that an airline emits more emissions than the 2019 baseline, that airline commits to offset the emissions so that the effect of its increase beyond that baseline is neutralized. Now, where is an international offset going to turn up from? Where is an offset for the international aviation emission going to come from? Now, if you think about what offsets are, from a greenhouse gas accounting perspective, an offset credit represents an abatement or an avoidance or a reduction or a removal of 1 ton of carbon, right? Now, the abatement opportunity exists in country. It doesn't happen in the international airspace, right? So what you're doing is you're going to a country, doesn't matter which country it is, and you're saying, will you sell me one of your -1 abatement tons to compensate for my +1 emission in CORSIA above +1, above my baseline? So the -1 +1 offset each other, and that's why the credits that are bought from countries are basically called offset credits. Now, these countries that are otherwise supplying these credits are countries within the Paris Agreement framework, and therefore the credits are not counted as part of the country's emissions inventory that the country has to report towards its Paris Agreement commitments. So now you get to this question that says, well, if a ton of abated emissions, a -1, is being used by an international airline for its CORSIA purposes, how do we ensure that the country that is also the host country that generates the -ton is not double reporting or double claiming that ton? And this is where the overlap between the Paris Agreement accounting framework, which starts from the 1st of January 2021, with the CORSIA phase 1, which is covering emissions that are also 2021 onwards overlap with each other. So in order to sort of deal with that problem, one of the things that the Technical Advisory Board, the TAB, which is a body set up under CORSIA to deal with very technical problems and questions like this, has basically said for any carbon offsets that are going to be used by an airline for CORSIA purposes in phase one, in order to avoid that the ton is also claimed by the country towards its NDC, we need a tool to avoid that double claiming, right? Now, this is where we start getting into double claiming or double counting and the equivalent accounting solutions that the Paris Agreement provides. And that is provided for under a mechanism called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement broadly says that countries will publish their nationally determined contributions, and they will do so, in other words, in a way that allows them to meet their NDC targets by achieving domestic emissions abatement. But if you want to ratchet up your ambition, you are allowed or invited under Article 6 to cooperate, to participate in cooperative arrangements with other countries. And between the two of you, one country pays for the other country's enhanced ambition to ratchet up their NDC, and the quid pro quo for that enhanced financing and support by the buying country is that the carbon tons represented by their investment are now capable of being used by the buying country to meet its NDC. So you take Singapore as an example, or Japan even, where the abatement opportunities are few and far between because they're already very energy efficient, highly developed countries. But the NDC commitment keeps going up every 5 years. So how do they meet their NDCs? And one of the ways is by funding abatement opportunity in the developing countries, as in not the Western world, but the other group of countries in the Paris Agreement, is saying to them, by working together with you, I will help you achieve your NDC targets by helping finance more expensive abatement. In return, please give me your carbon credits. And that's what Article 6 does as a mechanism. Now, obviously, if a country is meeting its NDC obligations under Article 6, but it's also exporting its ton to another country who's using it towards that country's NDC, there is a concern about those same Article 6 credit being used by both the host country and the buying country. So in order to avoid that from happening, there is a mechanism called corresponding adjustment in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that says the host country adds a +1 to its accounting balance sheet, emissions balance, representing the ton that it has exported, and the using country applies a -1 when it uses it towards its NDC. So it's basically a +1 -1 accounting exercise. Anybody who does sort of balance sheet accounting will understand the principle. But of course, now, if you think about what's happening with CORSIA, is that if that ton is coming out of the Paris Agreement into a completely different treaty, which is what ICAO is and CORSIA is, then there is no double counting because they're completely two different ledgers, right? It's not like within the same ledger I have a plus and a minus. I have two completely different ledgers where I've got a plus in one, but I don't have a corresponding minus anywhere else. So there is no double counting going on because nowhere am I counting that -1 towards a airline's commitment under under ICAO as being double counted against the country's commitment under its NDC. So there's no double counting. But arguably, if an airline is using it to claim that it's met its CORSIA obligation, and the host country is using it to claim I've used it towards meeting my NDC, then there is a scenario for double claiming, right? And essentially that's what the issue is from an ICAO perspective that they're trying to deal with. Now I'm going to pause there because I've given you a lot of introductory background in case you've got some questions, and I'll give you a chance to get a word in.
Yeah, no, I think that was super, that was super helpful, very clear, and provides some helpful backdrop into how these are kind of two separate ledgers, two separate organizations, and accounting methods. I think one thing that's interesting about the Paris Agreement is when you have this opportunity for corresponding adjustments that can bring carbon finance, green investments from developed nations that have, reduced opportunities to meet their NDC, to invest in developing nations, improve their green infrastructure, improve the quality of life theoretically of their population because the air is cleaner and they have lower emissions. So I think that's really attractive about the Paris Agreement. But one of the challenges is if you don't have this ledger really clear, the Article 6 opportunity to do those corresponding adjustments, it makes those investments, those green investments, a challenge. And so, I'm curious, what happens if a country doesn't apply that corresponding adjustment? Either in the Paris Agreement or CORSIA, who's on the hook for that, and what does that look like?
I think before we get to that, it's probably worth just mentioning that, of course, CORSIA's solution to double claiming has been to adopt the Article 6 corresponding adjustment obligation on tons that are going to qualify for the first phase of CORSIA, right? So the starting point is to say, well, what tons qualify? And the TAB has an assessment process for working out what those tons are. There's various sustainability criteria. There are various governance framework requirements that have to be met by the relevant issuing voluntary standard. But amongst them is also the requirement that there has to be an attestation by the host country that the ton will not be double claimed, right? Now, it doesn't say that the ton must be correspondingly adjusted. It says, I need you to ensure that the ton is not double claimed. Now, how a voluntary standard satisfies CORSIA or TAB about that it is not being double claimed can be done in more than one way. And when the TAB was looking at this, they identified three potential ways in which they could avoid a double claiming concern. The one that they ultimately settled on in guidance was that they would adopt double counting from the Article 6 corresponding adjustment framework. Now, because a ton exported by a host country has to be made up by that country, if the ton comes from within that country's NDC under the Paris Agreement, I'll start again. If that ton has to be exported, the host country has to do a corresponding adjustment, irrespective of whether or not that ton is part of that country's NDC or not. And this is something that's baked into Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So it doesn't matter from a Paris Agreement perspective whether or not the ton is inside the country's NDC or outside the country's NDC. The fact that the country is exporting it and therefore applying a corresponding adjustment means the country has to now make up an extra ton within that compliance period, that NDC period. So in one sense, the exporting of a ton adds an additional cost to the host country who is exporting it, right? Because they have to make up the ton. So the cost of making up the ton in that country is basically that country's cost of corresponding adjustment. Okay. Now, the cost of corresponding adjustment varies from country to country because every country's economic circumstance, their sources of emissions, their cost of abatement, therefore, varies based on who they are. So the World Bank published a paper last year in which they calculated, based on some calculation formula, what the comparative cost of a corresponding adjustment would be in Japan, in the United States, in Europe, and Asia and Africa. And it ranges. So Japan came from memory in around $125 a ton, Europe $135 a ton, the United States $150 a ton. So if the cost of corresponding adjustment is that high in the developed world, it is also similarly less costly for the developing world, because essentially the cost of abatement in the developing world is easier because there are less regulated markets, less regulated scenarios to which the opportunity for abatement in those countries are therefore greater. So if you take avoided deforestation as a source of abatement in a country like Indonesia, Indonesia's average cost of abatement is probably $5, $6 a ton if it's a REDD plus source. But if I look for the cost of a REDD plus abatement in Australia, the answer to that would be about $45 a ton. Just comparing apples against apples, but looking at the different circumstances of different countries. So the source of your abatement plus the country's cost of abatement becomes the differentiating factor between comparable sources of supply when you go and source these tons from different places. Now, one of the things that hasn't been factored into by the CORSIA market properly yet is what that cost of corresponding adjustment is truly going to be when the ton of abatement is supplied into the CORSIA market by insisting on a corresponding adjustment. And that, I think, is one of the challenges that the TAB is yet to grapple with, but is nonetheless something that follows on from the fact that they've insisted on a corresponding adjustment to deal with a double claiming problem. In other words, they've taken a double counting tool to fix a double claiming solution.
Anna, I wanted to hand off to you. I know you had a few questions for Peter.
Thanks, Erika, and thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me on the podcast again. I find that interesting, Peter, what you're talking about with the cost, and it's a little bit what we've already seen with the cost coming out under Article 6, I guess. For example, we're seeing that Ghana is adding $7, I believe, to their credits. And obviously, with such scarcity of credits that have received any letters of authorization and also corresponding adjustment, at this point, we only got one project from Guyana that we will have more or less 5 million tons of vintage 21, which is recognized under the CORSIA framework. But what I wanted to ask you is, of course, these Guyana credits have been approved on a registry called Architecture for REDD Plus Transactions, so ART in short. And they have been approved as well as American Carbon Registry, so that's ACR. And of course, for us at ClimeCo, we're project developers and we have a lot of projects on different registries. And we're very hopeful, of course, that Vera and Gold Standard and CAR, the other large registries that we have, that they will be approved in the meeting coming up in September, October, November, maybe. But how did the two approved registries, how did they solve for this? And why haven't we seen more registries approved? And if you don't mind shedding a bit of light, I would love to hear.
I think, Anna, your question dovetails a little bit to Erika's question, which is, what happens if a country doesn't do the corresponding adjustment that is expected of it as part of the eligibility criteria that TAB has now set for an eligible CORSIA ton. And you're right, ACR, American Carbon Registry, and ART are the two currently approved standards. And we are hoping that other standards will get approved in the upcoming September meeting. And your question is essentially, how come those other standards have a bit more to do when in fact these already have been approved? That's basically the gist of the question. Now, actually, the one thing that a lot of people don't know, and I say this with the clear-cut statement that I do not advise ART, so therefore what I'm saying is very much gleaned from what I get in the public domain. But ART actually was approved by TAB long before the 2021 crediting period started. So when when ART was approved during the pilot phase, it was already approved to issue carbon credits that would be eligible today in phase 1, because it had committed to solve the corresponding adjustment problem even back then. And the way it had committed to do that was to say that before the ART labels a ton as a CORSIA ton, the host country has to satisfy ART that it will carry out the corresponding adjustment by doing one of two things. Either it has to do the corresponding adjustment first and then ask for the labeling to be done. In other words, there's no risk that the corresponding adjustment won't be done. Or you have to provide, the host country has to provide a bank guarantee compensating ART for the cost of that corresponding adjustment not being done, right? Now, if you think about that solution that ART came up with way back when, that's not, I mean, pre-2021, pre any of this conversation around what gold standard has to do and Vera has to do. That was back then at the time when one of the unique features of ART was that they were dealing with, because it's a programmatic red plus system, they were dealing with the sovereign or the sub-state, subnational within the sovereign. So they were always dealing directly with the government. So for them, it was easier for them to directly say to the government, you don't do this, I don't put your label on, right? That's not the case necessarily with project developers. And this is where the ACR problem or the Vera problem or the gold standard comes in, when you're dealing with projects as opposed to subnational jurisdictional programs. So ART's situation is quite different, I think, from gold standard, Vera, and ACR. And ACR, I think, suffers from the same problem and the same challenge that Vera has, which is for the projects that are not jurisdictional, where you've got project developers developing the project, how do you procure that the corresponding adjustment will be done? Now, TABS has said, this is not the airline's problem. You, the standard, have decided to put a label to it. These are our criteria. You're the one saying that this criteria has been satisfied at the time you've put the label on. And therefore, if the label isn't true, because the corresponding adjustment subsequently is not carried out by the host country, well, that's your problem. Now, if you think about it, what TAB is saying is that the country not carrying out the corresponding adjustment, which is a sovereign risk, is a risk that this individual voluntary carbon standard is being asked to manage. And what they're saying is this is not the problem for the airline. They're not the ones who put the label on. They bought it in reliance on the label you, the standard, have put. Therefore, this is your problem. You figured this one out. Now, we can debate the merits of whether or not it's appropriate for a body which is a state-operated body, well, an international organ of an organ of an international body which is under an international treaty, i.e. quasi-sovereign in its own right. It's whether it's appropriate for that body to dump the risk on a private sector voluntary organization, rather than on the host country over which it has more likely got some kind of correlation, because the country in question is probably a signatory state to ICAO. But the problem is they've now borrowed something that doesn't belong in ICAO. They've taken a tool that belongs in under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and therefore there is no jurisdictional overlap between the airline state and the sovereign state that is necessarily the host country of the project. But they've forced this artificial connection by insisting on the corresponding adjustment tool. Now, again, the corresponding adjustment may not be the right tool for this problem, if there is the problem in the first place of double counting. And if there is a problem and you want to use corresponding adjustment, we can have a debate as to whether or not that it makes therefore sense to dump this risk on a private entity to manage sovereign risk. Now, the private entity, just to be clear, could either be the standard, or the standard has to get the project developer to compensate. So it's one of the two. TAB doesn't care which one of the two it is. But if it is going to be the project developer, it's going to be the standards condition to the project developer that you give me protection, you compensate me, you manage this liability that I'm taking on. Otherwise, I'm not going to put the label on. So whether or not the standard passes the buck on to the project developer or keeps the liability to itself is really the discussion and debate in the market right now. And what is unknown is necessarily what Vera and Gold Standard are doing about this, because neither of those two programs have necessarily published how they are going to manage that liability vis-a-vis the relevant project applicant who comes to them with a project and says, please label my ton as a CORSIA ton. That is pending the outcome of the September-October decision.
Yeah, and may I ask you then, Peter, as we discussed over the summer now, ICE, the exchange, has terminated the DEC 24 contract. And of course, we can speculate a little bit why. But most likely, I think there is a consensus that people think that there will not be enough CORSIA eligible units going into that contract because ART has not been approved to deliver into that contract. What do you think could potentially happen going into autumn? Have these problems? And of course, again, as a project developer, I can imagine that most are relatively small entities, and we are not necessarily willing to take on that liability. And we don't have, like you say, the influence over the countries where we operate in to actually take on this risk. So how do you see this developing? Because of course we also have an ICE contract for delivery of 25 that will soon start trading, and it's going to be very interesting to see if that will be a functioning contract if we don't have enough supply.
Look, I don't want to get into the specifics of the ICE contract or why. I think you're referring to the fact that they suspended the December contract quite recently. I don't want to get into that, mainly because I think we'd be speculating as to what the drivers for that are, and it won't be appropriate for me to speculate. But I would say that one of the challenges of the phase one tons is that they have to be correspondingly adjusted tons. Now, if you think about what a correspondingly adjusted ton essentially is, it's a ton where the country from which the ton has generated has made a commitment to then make up that ton and not count it towards its overall NDC. So that commitment cost, going back to the cost of the corresponding adjustment, rightly speaking, varies from country to country. So if you think about what the price of a correspondingly adjusted qualifying ton is it's going to basically be, well, whatever the cost of that ton is in that jurisdiction from which the supply is happening, plus the cost of the corresponding adjustment that country is asking for. So if you take Guyana, I think you mentioned $7. I don't know if that's the right number, but let's pretend that it is.
That was for Ghana. Sorry, Peter.
Ghana.
The $7 Ghana. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So $7 for Ghana, plus let's say it's a cook stove project for which there's another $6 for the cook stove ton, and I'm being generous there. So let's say that's 7 plus 6, and my maths is terrible, but that's what, $13 a ton, right? Now, if that's $13 a ton for a correspondingly adjusted CORSIA unit, again, the type of methodology, if it comes from a different country, from a different source, will mean that in another country, it'll be a different price. Avoided deforestation, but correspondingly adjusted. Afforestation, correspondingly adjusted. It just depends on the methodology and how the market will pay for it. So creating a common price is going to be challenging, because in a scarce market, you can probably guess or second guess where the supply is going to come from. But in a liquid market where a lot of these credits and tons are available, it means you have no idea what credit is delivered for the CORSIA compliance purposes. Now, the one message I can tell you that we keep getting from all of the airlines we have spoken to is that if they can meet their CORSIA obligations using the cheapest available ton, they will do it using the cheapest available ton. So nobody's going to buy a US correspondingly adjusted CORSIA ton when they can get one from Ghana at a tenth of the price, right? That's basically how the market's going to look at the ton from a compliance perspective. So if you go back now to the question of what does an airline look to source, well, they source a ton that meets the CORSIA criteria, which is the ton that promises to be correspondingly adjusted. The timing of the corresponding adjustment and the timing of the use by the airline may not coincide. So there is a clear chance that the airline uses it towards its own CORSIA compliance at a time the corresponding adjustment has not yet happened, and subsequently they find out that the corresponding adjustment never happened, right? So then the question is, what does the airline do about that? And TAB says, airline, you don't have to do anything. Relevant issuing standard, you're the one who now has to find another ton and surrender or cancel that and ensure that the environmental gap created by this failure to correspondingly adjust is now being compensated for. So it goes back to the question of, is it appropriate for a voluntary standard to handle sovereign risk? And what we're seeing in the market is that there are companies stepping into the void who are providing insurance solutions. I think Kita has announced something new. Oka has announced something. I'm not in the weeds of the qualitative differences between those insurances and whether or not they're capable of addressing the problems that now these voluntary standards have to carry. But there is going to need to be some kind of solution like that. A standard can look to a project developer and say, project developer, you will compensate. But the problem is, with the market being the way it is now, who knows if that project developer is going to be around in 2 years' time when the actual compensation need is going to arise, because they're not particularly the most creditworthy entity. So does the lack of creditworthiness on the part of the project developer then mean that that isn't a viable solution, right? And if the answer to that is they're not a viable solution, then you're back to the insurance solution. And if you're not in the world where the insurance solution is adequate, then you're back to the question of whether or not the standard takes the risk. And of course, we know that these standards are not, what would I say, the richest businesses in the world. A lot of them are not-for-profits. And you've got to then recognize, well, if the standard's not going to take the risk and the project developer can't bear the risk, is it appropriate for TAB to be putting this risk on those private sector entities? I mean, that question ultimately does have to be asked.
Thanks, Peter. And, you mentioned a lot that phase one is where TAB is requiring the corresponding adjustments. Is there potential, or has there been any hinting that phase two or a future phase of CORSIA compliance could evolve and, change its requirements because these are so complex and potentially risky if you're putting sovereign risk on a voluntary carbon developer registry?
I think the technical advisory body does recognize that the solution of using corresponding adjustment is a tough one, in the sense that it is importing all these other problems that we've just been talking about. And therefore, they are open to the idea that somebody comes to them and say, come up with a different way to solve my double counting dilemma, right? Sorry, double claiming dilemma, not double counting. There is no double counting. And I think the question is, well, is your double claiming dilemma a true dilemma? That's the first question I would say, right? So why is it important that you don't double claim? Well, the argument to that is, well, if you double claim, that means there's a lack of environmental integrity. But actually, I would argue in a slightly different way. If my emission abatement comes from a source that is not part of my NDC, and therefore I'm not counting it towards my NDC, how am I double claiming it, right? So there is a differential question that should be asked, which is, what is the source of the abatement in the host country? Does it come from that country's NDC, or does it come from outside that country's NDC? If it's outside that country's NDC, then there's no particular reason for you to be penalizing the host country by insisting on a corresponding adjustment when there is no double counting or double claiming, right? Now, there is an overarching sense that after 2030, the Paris Agreement NDCs are going to move towards all gases, all sectors. In other words, you have no sectors that notionally fall outside a host country's NDC. And they're going towards what's called the standardized NDC reporting approach. And once you get into that world, it's hard to identify carbon offsets that come from outside a country's NDC. But that's after 2030, which is still 6 years away from now. So you don't have this problem in that sense until you hit 2030, number one. And even if you do, if you think about what an NDC with all sectors, all gases looks like, and how that works on a differential basis, the example would be the EU taking a 2050 target and China taking a 2060 target, right? Clearly, in 2050, there are parts of the Chinese economy that do not match the EU's equivalent. So those parts, whether you measure them in comparable reduction targets, mean that if you overperform that country's NDC, then that would notionally be outside that country's NDC, right? So by definition, there will always be tons that you can point to and say that this is outside the country's NDC and therefore doesn't count towards the country's NDC and therefore isn't subject to double counting or double claiming and therefore doesn't correspondingly adjust it. But that requires a sense of confidence in the reporting mechanisms that the countries will be using for their corresponding adjustment, their corresponding adjustment purposes under Article 6. Frankly, we haven't even managed to get Article 6 fully operational yet, and therefore we don't really know how the accounting and reporting process is going to work properly. And therefore, it's very difficult to therefore say that an Article 6 solution is the right solution for CORSIA as things stand today. And I think that's the conversation that the TAB is not trying to have and is running away from, because there is this perception of double claiming, and I'm absolutely clear there's no double counting, but there's a perception that double claiming is a problem here. I don't necessarily buy that personally, but that's just my personal view.
I had one other question. You mentioned earlier, US's cost of a corresponding adjustment could be around $150. Japan, you said what, $125, $130.
Yep.
Is there any indication that the countries have actually said that's what they're going to charge?
So I think the biggest problem and this is something we covered, I think, in the last podcast when we talked about why COP28 was partially a failure in terms of Article 6 negotiation decisions being made. And it's the realization that most countries today that are what we would call in the non-developed country bucket are all struggling to work out their GHG accounting. And by that I mean they don't necessarily have the laws in place to create mandatory reporting of greenhouse gases. So they don't actually have full mastery of their own inventory. And if you don't have control over your inventory, if you don't have an understanding of your sources of emissions, you do not have the position to say, my comparative cost of abatement for this emission source is X and that emission source is Y. And therefore, for the purposes of my current NDC, I will use up my cheaper cost of abatement, for which I don't need external financing, and I will use external financing for the more expensive abatement that I know I can't afford. But that assumes you know which one it is, you know that it can be afforded, you know that this one is priced at X, and you know that one is priced at Y. The majority of countries today are not in a position, as in the majority of countries that are not Western developed countries, who've been doing this for 30 years already, are not in a position to know that calculation. And therefore, for them, their cost of abatement today is probably not much more sophisticated than simply putting a finger up in the air and saying, how much are you going to pay me, right? What can I get away with? So when Anna says Ghana's cost is $7, I don't think that's its true average cost of abatement. I think that's the price they feel that in a competitive market they can probably get away with. As opposed to another country who'll say, my true cost of abatement is more likely 25, but I don't see anybody paying me that. Which is why I say the cost of corresponding adjustment, in fact, is a penalty for the country, because you're paying $7 for what is a true cost of abatement of 25.
Yeah, I mean, that makes it seem like there's limited incentive for any country to want to participate in this program.
Which then takes you to the obvious conclusion that CORSIA eligible tons would be difficult to get your hands on. And even when you do get your hands on them, you will not necessarily be convinced about the commitment of the country's willingness to do a corresponding adjustment. I'll give you an example. In the context of some work we were doing for a client, we looked at Kenya quite recently. And Kenya has published a fairly detailed set of regulations around how its carbon framework will work. It's appointed its nationally its body for managing the approval process. It's gone through the parliamentary process, and it's all very, very good. And when the conversation arose about, well, what happens in the theoretical situation where Kenya says that it will do a corresponding adjustment and doesn't do its corresponding adjustment, the answer that you often get from local council is, well, we're a very stable government. We don't have coups like other West African countries, and therefore if our government makes a commitment, even if there is a change of government, people will follow. And next thing I know is you have strikes and protests in Kenya where the president is on wobbly feet trying to deal off problems associated with his trying to raise tariffs and taxation in the local market. And you now say, well, Kenya is not as stable as it was even 2 months ago, right? And that's the point about the way in which countries' commitments to their corresponding adjustments should be looked at, which is you never can predict the future. And therefore, what you've got to do is you've got to recognize is that sovereign risk is sovereign risk. And not everybody is capable of dealing with that risk. And therefore, it should be recognized that sovereign risk requires very particular skills and very particular tools for handling, right? And, there are World Bank insurance products launched by an organization called MIGA. And MIGA, from what we know, is developing a product that will assist with some of this risk. But that product has not yet, as far as I know, been finalized and has not made it to market. So I can't even tell you whether or not the MIGA insurance will be the right product because I haven't seen it and therefore I can't comment on it. But if it does, theoretically, it could solve some of these issues. But then the cost of that MIGA insurance will have to be borne by the airline operators ultimately because it will be passed through in the cost of the ton.
Right. And when it's borne by the airline, eventually it's borne by the consumer,
Correct.
Right, who's buying that flight. And, we've been talking a lot about an offset as a compliance tool for CORSIA, but there is another tool, right, to comply, and that would be with sustainable aviation fuel. And you recently released another paper about sustainable aviation fuel, which we will link in the show notes. And I know it's kind of a whole nother can of worms, but I wanted to ask you, can you give us just a little peek into what are the challenges with using biofuels as a compliance tool?
I mean, you're right. It opens another can of worms. But we recognize that there is a significant interrelationship in terms of CORSIA airline compliance between sustainable aviation fuels and sustainable and eligible carbon offsets. And the reason for this is because the CORSIA scheme itself says that an airline can use one or either or both, right? You can either use sustainable aviation fuel, or rather, to be precise, CORSIA eligible fuels, or you can use eligible carbon offsets. You could use a mixture of both. You could use one or the other. Now, if you think about this practically, the airline is going to say, I'm going to use whatever is the cheapest cost of compliance for me. And for an airline to do that equation, it kind of knows what the eligible sustainable aviation fuel is today, and they know the rough cost of it. The cost is about 5 times higher than normal jet fuel, right? And that's because there isn't enough production of, and therefore availability of, CORSIA eligible fuels in the market today. And we'll come back to some of the deviations between the grades of CORSIA eligible fuels and sustainable aviation fuels that exist out there that are also competing against each other for some of that available demand and available supply. But let's now just focus on the comparison between using CORSIA eligible fuels and CORSIA eligible credits. Well, we've just talked about the fact that we don't know what the cost of a CORSIA eligible credit really is because there's not enough supply in the market that allows you to work that out. So now you're into this situation of unequal or uneven information source on pricing and supply and availability, and one has no correlation with the other from an availability and supply challenge perspective. It's not like there are common challenges across both. They're completely different challenges associated with each one. And therefore, they're running on two completely separate paths in terms of how an airline looks at each one of them and says, well, which one is going to be cheaper for me? And guess what? There is the third limb of this, which we haven't talked about, and that is that most countries, most states who are ICAO states, haven't yet told their airlines what the cost of their failing to meet their CORSIA compliance obligations will be. So in fact, it's not just a question of how much does it cost for me to meet my CORSIA obligations using CORSIA eligible fuels, or how much does it cost me to use eligible carbon offsets. It's also, what if I don't comply at all? Is that cheaper? and that depends on a piece of legislation that most countries, including the UK, are yet to pass, which is, what is the cost of your failure to surrender a requisite number of carbon credits equal to your emissions under your, above your baseline, according to CORSIA? And nobody knows the answer to that question. And if the UK airlines don't know the answer to that question, you can be sure that, other airlines in other countries don't know the answer to that question. So you're in this world where different airlines who are looking over their shoulder at other airlines for competition reasons and are trying to compete against attracting the same passenger are passing on the costs of their flights and their costs of compliance to their passengers, will say, well, if I make the wrong choice about which compliance route I take, non-compliance SAF purchases or CORSIA eligible fuel purchases or CORSIA carbon offset purchases, that passing down of that cost to my customer is going to be the difference between, am I competitive on certain routes and am I not competitive on certain routes? And that choice is something that the airlines are struggling to make today because there isn't enough supply of CORSIA eligible fuels, and there's certainly not enough supply of CORSIA eligible credits. So airlines, in fact, are doing nothing because they feel that they don't have the tools to do anything at this point. So what you've got is this stage where actually neither is there supply and nor is there immediate demand, because the airlines are all saying, well, I don't have to surrender my first phase units until sometime in 2028. Why do I have to worry about this now? I'll just wait until nearer to the time. And I think that's causing another problem in the market, which is, why should people bother with supply when there is no demand today? The demand won't turn up until 2028. So you're into this vicious cycle of, which comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Well, this was so interesting to learn more and really dig into what are the challenges in this marketplace, this transition from using voluntary credits into a compliance mechanism, the voluntary phase to phase one to mandatory phase of CORSIA, and how the different countries are going to address these challenges. So thank you so much, Peter. I'm sure there's more to say, and I think we'll all be watching to see what happens with both the corresponding adjustments, how are countries addressing this, and what credits are going to become available, and how are they traded and who's buying them. So lots more to hear and lots more to see how this develops. Really appreciate your time, Peter. And, we'd love to have you back maybe in a year from now or 6 months to say, how's it evolved? There's going to be a lot.
Erika, could I just I just want to correct. Basically, I was telling Peter that Ghana has got a fee of $7, but it's $5 for the corresponding adjustment fee from Ghana, just so that we get that clear. And of course, we need
what a deal.
Yeah, we also need to say that obviously that is for ITMOs, right? So those are not under, just so that there are no listener out there thinking that we have any CORSIA aligned credits from Ghana, but those are for the internationally transferred mitigation outcomes under Article 6. But obviously that is what a lot of people in the market are waiting for, that we will get these cook stove projects out under gold standard or Vera. So I just wanted to clarify that so that we have everything straight.
Anna, thank you for making that clarification. I did think the number 7 was a bit odd, which is why I think when you said it, I said, well, let's go with that number, assuming you're right.
Yeah. No, it was 5.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me. I hope I haven't confused people rather than help clarify.
I think the next piece we'll see, how does this impact consumers, right? There's all these different prices, but how does that impact the actual price for a ticket, right? Translating the price per ton of the emissions into a price per ticket and duration and all of that, I think that's also going to evolve. And as you mentioned, Peter, this is a competitive landscape. So how do the airlines continue to retain their customers and grow their routes?
Well, Lufthansa has, to your point, already announced a SAF charge, Sustainable Aviation Fuel charge, with certain tickets and certain routes. And Virgin Atlantic in the UK, I think yesterday, made a similar announcement. Different prices, right? And that's because they represent different strategies and different sourcing opportunities. So that again feeds into this question of, well, we're 2 airlines, we both have different routes, we both have different sources of supply, and therefore we have different competitive advantages in terms of how we are effectively passing on this cost. So again, the airlines will have to start getting more sophisticated, both in their SAF procurement as well as their carbon offset procurement in the long run, to be able to be more competitive vis-a-vis each other. And I think we are only at the beginning of that beginning to play out. And in a year's time, I suspect we'll be talking about most EU airlines having introduced some kind of SAF charge. But then the parallel will be, well, if I've got a SAF charge, why am I then paying a CORSIA charge? Because that's then, some form of double compensation to the airline. So that will become another conversational point, I suspect, in a year's time.
Yeah, and just one thing that also interests me about SAF is it's a physical fuel, so you need to refine it and actually get it onto an airplane, as opposed to an offset that you could theoretically buy from anywhere with no connection to the actual airplane and airport and fuel infrastructure. So it has its own level of complications there.
Yes, and that's being addressed by different book and claim systems that are being introduced, and I'm aware of at least 4 of them, and that's just in the aviation space. And then add to the equivalent issues that you have in the maritime space with sustainable marine fuel, where they're developing their own book and claim system. It becomes a very complex area, and I'm doing my best to stay on top of it. That's all I can say.
Yes, I think we'll need another lesson on how those book and claim progress, how those programs develop, who's going to be the winner, are there 10 winners, and how do we make sure that we're using the right accounting methods, and making sure also that perfect doesn't get in the way of good and progress.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Erika.
Whether you're a seasoned ESG practitioner or embarking on your sustainability journey, ESG Decoded is your trusted source for inspiration and actionable insights for responsible business practices. Subscribe on your favorite streaming platforms to be notified of new episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday mornings, and connect with us at ESG Decoded on social media or by visiting www.climeco.com.